started. Thank you everybody for joining this distinguished webinar series in AI and cybersecurity. It's co-sponsored by School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and Center for Artificial Engineering, Center for Artificial Intelligence Initiative in Cybersecurity. Today with us, we have Dr. Kurt Luther. Dr. Kurt Luther is an associate professor of computer science at Virginia Tech and a founding faculty member of the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus near Washington, D.C. He is also the Associate Director for Research in the Center for Human-Computer Interaction, a faculty affiliate of the National Security Institute, and an adjunct professor at Virginia Military Institute. Dr. Luther directs Virginia Tech's Crowd Intelligence Lab, where his team researches the complementary strengths of crowdsourced human intelligence and artificial intelligence. The lab's current projects focus on improving open source intelligent analysis, combating disinformation and misinformation, identifying unknown people and places in historical and modern photos, and understanding real-world crowdsourced investigation. Dr. Luther has been honored with the National Science Foundation Career Award, and he is an ACM Senior Member. His papers have received the ACM CSCW Best Paper Award, the AAAI HCOMP Notable Paper Award, and ACM IUI Best Paper Award. His software has won the Microsoft Cloud AI Research Challenge Grand Prize and 2 HCOMP Best Demo Awards. His research has been funded by many federal agencies and other industries, CCI, DoD, Google, NEH, NHPRC, NIH, and NSF, and featured by The Atlantic, the CNN, Historic Channel, NPR, Smithsonian, and Time. Previously, Dr. Luther was a postdoctoral fellow in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. He received his PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech, where he was a James D. Foley Scholar. He received his BS in computer graphics technology with honors and highest distinction from Purdue University. He also interned at IBM Research, Microsoft Research, and YouTube and Google. That's quite a mouthful and a lot of honors and accolades. And it is my distinguished pleasure to invite you as part of this series. Thank you so much for spending your time, Dr. Kurt. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And let me go ahead and get my screen shared for everybody. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Thank you very much again for the invitation to speak with all of you. This is really an honor for me. And I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the research that my group has been doing the last few years at Virginia Tech. And the title of the talk, as you can see here, is Crowd Sleuths, Solving Mysteries with Crowdsourcing Experts and AI. And you may be wondering what I mean by crowd sleuths and what I mean by solving mysteries. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a much better understanding of what I mean by those ideas. So let's jump right in. And let's start by talking a little bit about crowdsourced investigations. Now, these have been around for quite a long time, really going back 150 years or more in the United States. You're seeing here an example of an early wanted poster looking for John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators who were involved in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. This was one of the first posters to use photographs to try to help the public identify suspects. Certainly the technologies have changed over the years and decades since then. Nowadays, we have websites such as the FBI's Most Wanted webpage that you're seeing there. We also have television. I was amazed to learn that America's Most Wanted, the TV show, has been responsible for the capture of over 1,000 fugitives. It's been a pretty successful enterprise, not just an entertaining TV show. And you may be familiar with this Trace an Object project. This is a web-based project run through Europol, and their goal is to try to combat human trafficking and child exploitation by asking the public and sort of crowdsourcing the identification of objects in evidence photos. So asking people if they recognize clothing, locations, toys, things like that. So we're seeing this evolution of technologies used for crowdsourced investigations. And one of the big things that's changed is that these technologies, like websites, social media, online communities, they're actually allowing the public to self-organize its own investigations. Now we have online communities on Reddit, individual forums like Web Sleuths, and social media platforms where lots of groups have started up around different types of crime solving, investigating cold cases, and things like that. And this is really quite different from what's been possible in the past, and it raises some interesting questions. Most notably among them, and maybe the question you have as well, is, does it work? Are any of these groups actually successful? And there are some pretty amazing success stories of crowdsourced investigations. I'll just give you a little sampling here of some headlines from recent years where people in online communities have successfully organized these crowdsourced investigations for finding missing persons, naming criminal suspects. It's even become kind of a pop culture phenomenon. There's been TV shows and movies in the last couple of years that are focused on crowdsourced investigations and kind of exploring the strengths and weaknesses of this concept in a fictional setting. Although this Netflix documentary they might have seen is actually based on real crowdsourced investigations. So we're kind of coming full circle here. So there are some success stories, but there's also a lot of prominent failures. And in fact, many people are more familiar with these failure cases than they are the successes. For example, the best known crowdsourced failures of crowdsourced investigation was the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. So if you're not familiar, after this terrible bombing happened at the Boston Marathon, the FBI released surveillance footage of suspects and asked the public to try to help identify them. So a lot of people did, and in particular, members of online communities like Reddit and 4chan tried to figure this out. And basically, long story short, they failed. They ended up naming several innocent suspects, innocent people. And one of those turned out to be an individual that had committed suicide. You can imagine how tough that was for the family. What did this end up looking like? You can imagine all the online conversations that evolved around these incidents, and some of the theories that people tried to discuss, some of the graphical representations that you're seeing here. But unfortunately, they didn't really go anywhere successful. So as a result, sort of the mainstream press response to this was, this is a bad idea. Crowdsourced investigations are vigilantism, they're digital witch hunts. This is something that we need to stop doing. So my question for you is, do you think that people stop doing this? Did anybody listen? No, they didn't. In fact, there have been quite a lot more crowdsourced investigations since then, and a lot more failures. We had Pizzagate in 2016. A man named Edgar Welch, he was from North Carolina. He became convinced by online conspiracy theories that there was a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was actually a secret headquarters for a child kidnapping ring. So he drove up there and self-investigated by firing a gun into the restaurant a few times. Ultimately was arrested, as you can see there. In 2017, we had the Unite the Right rally at University of Virginia. And this was a white nationalist event that was well documented through photos and videos that bystanders took. You can see one of those on the left here. And so these photos and videos were posted online. People tried to figure out who those white nationalists were. And one group of Twitter users noticed this man with his beard and glasses and Arkansas engineering shirt and thought they could use those clues to identify him. And they settled on a man named Colloquia, who was a faculty member at the University of Arkansas in engineering. And they decided that it was him. And unfortunately, it was not him. In fact, he wasn't even in the state at the time. But unfortunately, his family and he were subject to threats, and they had to move out of their home for a while and so forth. And then just a couple of years ago, when the George Floyd protests were sweeping the nation, there was also lots of crowdsourced investigations going on here as well. There was a man who was video recorded on a bike trail in the DC area, physically assaulting and pulling flyers out of the hands of some young people that were distributing material for protests. And he was incorrectly identified as well. An innocent man was doxxed, and his home address was posted and so forth. So this kind of thing just keeps happening sort of again and again. Rather than going away, it actually seems to be more frequent than ever. The question becomes, what can we do about this? How might we do better from, in my case, a human-computer interaction perspective or computer science perspective? So my lab has looked at these types of investigations from a couple of perspectives. First is analysis, thinking about what investigators currently do, professionals, and what can we learn from them? What are they doing well? What challenges do they run into? And where might they get help? So we're trying to deeply understand those experts' current workflows and practices, seeing opportunities where something like crowdsourcing might add value, and what are the limitations and strengths of AI in these kind of real-world use cases that we need to know about before we introduce it. And then after studying these contexts, we ultimately want to design or build systems to try to address these issues. So we want to harness and direct crowd enthusiasm. We know people are interested to do this kind of thing, and it just keeps happening. But maybe more structured interfaces that allow them to make more targeted, high-quality contributions would be more successful. And perhaps we should allow the experts, the professional journalists, professional law enforcement, and so on, to guide the overall process and make final decisions about things like who the suspects are and whether they are guilty of what they're being accused of. And finally, we need to think about, back to the title of this talk, the complementary strengths of these different resources. Experts who are highly skilled and trained, but limited in their time and attention. Crowds that are large and scalable and diverse, but oftentimes not trained and maybe only have novice or amateur levels of knowledge and experience. And artificial intelligence, really good at some kinds of things, not as good at others. And of course, that's always a moving target as AI advances are really changing the face of computing year after year. So this is kind of what I'd like to spend the rest of this talk focusing on. My group has done a lot of work in these areas and in these four major themes. Number one, crowdsourced image geolocation, which is trying to identify where specifically on Earth a photo or video was taken as accurately as possible. Crowdsourced intelligence analysis, using crowdsourcing to analyze large amounts of evidence, in this case, textual evidence, and trying to identify hidden patterns or connections between those pieces of evidence that suggest a larger plot or a larger activity. And person identification from historical photographs using hybrid crowd AI approaches, leveraging those complementary skills. And finally, what these crowdsourced investigations look like in the wild, not just in the software tools that we build in our lab. And I've mentioned a bunch of examples so far, but we've done more in-depth studies of things like crowdsolve, social open source intelligence investigations, and sedition hunters online community on Twitter. I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. Rather than just giving you a little bit of everything, I think today I'd like to give a deeper dive into a couple of these themes on the left here that I think would be of particular interest. But I'll give you a quick sampling of some of those other projects on the right that I encourage you to take a look at later, or I'd be happy to answer questions about those. So this crowdsourced intelligence project, we're trying to see if crowdsourced novices can support an expert intelligence analyst in sorting through big piles of text documents, things like police reports, in order to see if there's some kind of connections between them that suggests a larger interconnected plot. So for example, if a car gets stolen in one place in Virginia and a person goes missing in another part of Virginia, is there some connection between those crimes that suggests something even more suspicious is underway? So we took inspiration from what's called the sense-making loop for intelligence analysts. This is kind of a human factors study of what intelligence analysts do and what they're modeling their thought process as they go from the raw evidence to a polished hypothesis or theory about what they think is going on. And we came up with this idea of context slices, which is, can we provide each individual crowd worker just a little bit of evidence and a little bit of context enough that they can make some progress in stitching together this plot without having to show them more content than they have time for and overwhelming them. So ultimately, we were able to show workers maybe just one or two documents at a time, have them draw some conclusions, and through this pipeline that you see here, scaffolded up to an entire sense-making workflow. We also looked at, in a follow-up study, bottlenecks. Where does this pipeline break down? Which parts do crowds struggle most with, and where can the expert kind of jump in and get things moving again? I also mentioned looking at, we've been looking at crowdsourced investigations in the wild, and in particular, we're interested in success stories and what people are doing right that we could learn from. A couple of years back, we went to an event called Crowdsolve that was hosted in Seattle, and it was a very interesting event. There were over 200 people co-located for a weekend who were sort of true crime enthusiasts, and they were partnering up with law enforcement, some local detectives who had some cold cases that they wanted to see if they could make some headway in. So for this weekend, there was this very structured process of providing the crowd with case files and kind of systematically working through them, and bringing in some outside law enforcement experts to talk about specific types of techniques or evidence, and ultimately trying to come up with some new theories of what happened. And they were actually able to make some additional progress through this effort. And then finally, we've also been exploring the landscape of what's called OSINT, or open source intelligence investigations. These are investigations that are done entirely with publicly available data. 50 years ago, this was of interest to the federal government for things like understanding what other countries are up to by analyzing their radio broadcasts and maybe newspapers and things like that. But in recent years, it's more likely to mean digital data, people's activities and conversations on social media. And so it's been a real wealth of interesting activities on the crowdsourced investigation front. And at recent events like the Ukraine war have really put open source investigations into the forefront. This is one of the primary mechanisms that journalists and even the military are using to try to understand what's happening. And so this study was trying to map out this landscape of different types of social OSINT activities and sort of where competition and collaboration fit in and where they can integrate more effectively. All right, so with that, let's talk a little bit about these other themes. And essentially, this is going to be my outline for the rest of the talk. First, I'll talk about this crowdsourced image geolocation project, and moving on to the historical person identification work. And I'll add in some final thoughts at the end of the talk. All right, so let's jump right in. And let's talk about crowdsourced image geolocation. And essentially what we're trying to do here is identify places in modern photographs. These are some of my students that were contributing to this project. And you may ask, why is this something that we would want to do? Why is image geolocation valuable? There's a few different reasons I can give you. One is verifying or debunking breaking news is increasingly a place where we want to geolocate images. You know, if there's a natural disaster or a man-made one that's in progress and people are posting all kinds of photos and videos on social media claiming to be of this event, which ones are real and which ones are fake and which ones are real, but they're actually 10 years old, like in this example here. We can also use geolocation for locating sites where criminal activity or terrorist activity is happening. Sometimes terrorist organizations post propaganda videos and photos on social media and inadvertently give information out about where their training camps are or where they themselves can be located. This is of interest to lots of national security folks. And it's also really valuable for human rights work, documenting where war crimes are happening and where human rights violations happen. The more information you can get about these photos, the more likely they are to serve this role of evidence and can be used for things like arrest warrants or other types of accountability later on in the pipeline. So let me give you an example of a successful image geolocation that took place through crowdsourcing. So a series of videos was posted on Facebook, and they claimed to show a Libyan commander named Mahmoud al-Wafali, and he was claimed to have been involved in some mass executions near Benghazi. So the question is, how can these claims be verified? So a group of crowd workers from an online community of open source investigators called Bellingcat, they sought to do this. So they analyzed the videos where these murders supposedly took place, and they made a panorama of the video like you see here. And from the panorama, they drew an aerial diagram of this location. So this is kind of what you would see, you can imagine looking from the sky downward at this area. And so that made it easier to search satellite imagery of the city of Benghazi and its surroundings for a match. And that's what they eventually were able to find. You can see here, it's not a perfect diagram, but it was good enough to get the job done to locate that physical location. Once they had a candidate location from the satellite imagery, then they could start to confirm it by matching all the other landmarks in the videos to the satellite imagery. So basically, far away from these murders, these crowdsourced investigators were able to use just free and open source tools and data to identify this location, and that was a key step in verifying them as evidence of war crimes. So in 2017, the International Criminal Court made its first ever arrest warrant that was based exclusively on social media evidence. It was the first arrest warrant of that type ever. So how can we support this type of work? If you're a computer scientist, your initial reaction might be to ask, can we use AI? And indeed, there has been some really exciting work in the computer vision community to try to do this type of image geolocation automatically. And although there's been some nice progress, we're still not yet at the point of being able to pinpoint locations for most photographs. Maybe if there's an obvious landmark like the Eiffel Tower, you might be able to get a hit right away. But for the most part, we're talking about levels of accuracy. So the two systems that are kind of focused on global scale image geolocation are planet and into GPS. And you can see on this chart here how the accuracy kind of goes down as you get more fine-grained. So if you want to correctly locate the continent of a photo like this one on the left here, these systems will give you they'll overlay a grid on the globe, and they will give you cells that are more or less likely to contain the match. So at the continent level, you might get 70% accuracy. But if you start going down to even the city level accuracy, you're talking about 24% or 33% or something like that. Even at the street level of 1 kilometer, which is way too large to be of use to a human rights investigator, we're only talking about accuracy in the 10% range. So these tools can be useful as a starting point, but if we want to pinpoint down to the street level or even the street corner level, we need some help. And that's where our research kind of picked up on, is how could we augment these computer vision pipelines with crowdsourced expertise? So cut to the chase and show you the system that we built. And then we'll back up and talk a little bit about why we built it that way. But let me show you a video with some of the key features straight off. So the system is called GroundTruth. And you can see here, this is the experts user interface. So up here on the left is the photo they're trying to geolocate. Down here on the bottom left is the aerial diagram that the expert drew. This is the overhead view. And then on the right here is the search space. So if they have some claim they're trying to verify that maybe this photo is in the city of Los Angeles, then that's kind of their starting point. And from here, they can look at that satellite view of Los Angeles and decide, is there a even more specific area that might be promising, or should I just select the entire city as my search area? So whatever they end up picking, they will select that, and then that becomes a search region that can be divided up for crowdsourced analysis. So remember these grids, because on the next screen here, we're going to see one of those grids in action. So this is the crowd worker interface. So every crowd worker, and there could be dozens or hundreds on an investigation, they see this tool, and they're seeing a 4x4 grid of cells that they're supposed to investigate on the left here, and then the experts diagram on the top here. So they're comparing the diagram to these satellite tiles, and they're giving a rating of, yes, maybe this could be the location, or no, I don't think this cell is correct. And then they move on to the next one. Red means no, green means yes or maybe. So you have dozens or hundreds of these workers doing this in parallel. The whole task takes about 10 minutes, and since it's in parallel, that's the total time required. And then the experts see something like this happening in real time. Those cells are getting filled in. Red means I don't really have to focus on that area. Green means this could be what I'm looking for. And we do have some redundancy. So we have 3 workers looking at each cell. So a darker green or a more vibrant green means multiple workers have flagged that as yes or maybe. So that's even more promising as a place to start. The expert kind of zooms in here, and they can investigate more carefully, and they can exclude cells that don't look promising by using this exclude button that turns things black. And eventually they may find what it is that they're looking for. In case it's not obvious, this is what they're looking for. It does take a little bit of a mindset to get this right. You need some practice, but this crosswalk here with this blue sign is exactly what's being shown in this ground level photo here. You can see why some practice and some expertise is valuable. So why did we choose to design it this way? Well, first we took some inspiration from human AI collaboration and some of the work that Jeff Hare has done talking about shared representations, primarily in information visualization and visual analytics. And the three principles we tried to map into a crowdsourced context with GroundTruth. So here talks about it's valuable to promote value and efficiency and correctness and consideration of alternatives when you're augmenting a human capability with AI. So that led us to create this aerial diagram and kind of a shared lens that helps the crowd and the expert look at the same thing. Here also suggests that AI should augment but not replace what the human's doing, and the blend-in should be as non-disruptive as possible. So likewise with GroundTruth, we created this shared environment that indicated where the crowd worker should search using this gridded map overlay. And finally here suggests that with AI, the tools should require neither perfect accuracy nor exhaustive modeling to be useful. So we don't want to design a tool where the AI has to be perfect in order to be valuable. Likewise, this heat map that we generated tries to kind of overlay onto what the expert's already doing with some additional insight and maybe some prioritization. But even if some of those workers are wrong, it can still help streamline what the individual expert's doing. All right, so then the next question becomes, what do we show? So I want to spend some time on this other set of projects that's also looking at photos, and it's also looking at the collaboration between crowds and experts. However, here we're talking about historical photos, and we're also integrating AI in a more in-depth way than we did in the previous project. So here's some students that have helped me out with this project. And again, I think it's valuable to motivate this and ask, why do we want to identify people in historical photographs? So first and foremost, we can offer corrections to the historical record. Sometimes these photo investigations can lead to new understandings of history, like in the case of this author who wrote a book about his father, who he believed was one of the Marines in this famous photo from World War II. And it turned out some evidence came along later that his father wasn't one of those people. They can also generate economic value. You can identify photographs that could turn out to be really valuable. In this case, here's a fun story of a photo purchased at a flea market that was confirmed to have an image of Billy the Kid, the famous outlaw, and was appraised at being worth millions of dollars. And it can also help us recognize contributions from marginalized groups. I really like this example from Twitter a few years ago of a photograph of a biology conference where one African-American woman was pictured in here, but her name didn't appear in the caption of the photo. So there was a crowdsourced investigation to identify her as a scientist named Sheila Miner Huff. And now we know who she is and that she played an important role in the early history of the field. So we have to start our investigation somewhere more specific. And so we've chosen to focus on photos from the American Civil War. This turns out to be a pretty interesting time for photography. And in fact, some people call these photos from the American Civil War the social media of their era, because photos were just becoming cheap enough that anybody could afford to have one taken. And at the same time, war is breaking out and everybody wants photos of their loved ones to take with them and to have with them as they're traveling off to war. So millions of these photos were produced. Today, over 150 years later, millions of them still survive, but only 10 to 20% of them are actually identified. People didn't really bother to write the names on the back of them most of the time. So this is a big challenge for us today. And all kinds of people like historians, antiques dealers, genealogists, they want to know who these photos depict. In fact, this has been a very popular activity on social media, and new groups have sprung up to do this kind of work, as you can see here. So what do they actually do nowadays? Let me walk you through an example like before. Here's a Civil War photo that we're trying to identify. And in fact, we have clues on both the front and the back of the photo. On the front, we of course have the soldier's face, but we have a lot of other clues too. The uniform, the weapons, even the props that the photographer might have used can be clues. The back of the photo can also have clues. If we're lucky, it has a photographer name or the location of the studio. That's a valuable clue. This tax stamp can also date the photograph to a specific period during the war. So let's take all these clues and kind of work through an example. Suppose you have this unknown photograph here of this soldier, and you see from his uniform these these two columns of buttons and this hat that he's actually the rank of brigadier general. And it turns out that seems like it'd be a pretty easy thing to identify. How many generals could there be in the Civil War? Well, quite a lot. One reference book has over 500 of these generals, but if you page through that book looking for this guy's face, you're not going to find it. In fact, what we discover later is his uniform is representing an honorary brigadier general. And the only way you would know that is if you went through this other book with 1,400 more photos of generals. And if you're going through that book, which is pretty hard to find, you might eventually come across a guy that looks like him. And then you can visually and facially confirm him as a man named George Rutherford. Now, you don't want to stop here. You want to confirm this ID. So you want to look at things like, where was the photograph taken? If it was taken in Washington, D.C., like this one, and it has a tax stamp that suggests it was between 1864 and 66, does that map onto George Rutherford? And if we look at his biographical information, we see that indeed he was based in the D.C. area during the war, and he would have been there in 1864 to 66. So this helps confirm that ID. So this is quite a laborious process. It takes a long time. It's very prone to error. And if you blink, you miss it. And also you need access to these photo resources, these reference books in the first place. So we wondered if we could improve on that process. That led us to develop a software tool called Civil War Photo Sleuth. And you can actually check this out yourself. It's free at civilwarphotosleuth.com. We built this in partnership with Paul Quigley in the History Department at Virginia Tech and Ron Coddington, who's editor of a magazine called Military Images. So we launched this site in 2018, and we seeded it with about 20,000 identified Civil War photos from different public and private reference sources. And now, 5 years later, we have over 50,000 photos, many of which were contributed by users. And we actually have over 20,000 registered users. So let me show you what this software tool looks like. I'll walk you through this interface here. And again, we'll go back and look at the rationale. But this is the dashboard. You would, from here, upload a photo that you're trying to identify and provide as much contextual information as you have. If you know the source, where can I go and find this image later, you would add that information. And once the photo is uploaded, then you would try to tag it with any visual clues that you recognize. So those would be especially helpful for the uniform. Here we see as a dark colored coat. His shoulder straps have this insignia of an eagle. Those are both useful clues to help narrow down possibilities. So this tool on the next page converts those tags into search filters. So the dark colored coat means that he served for the Union Army, and the eagle symbol means that he held the rank of colonel. So these search filters can be applied against the biographical data that we have for each reference image, and then they're sorted using face recognition by facial similarity. So we're going to see the top matches here are the most facially similar, but they also have matching biographical details drawn from those visual uniform clues. So from here, the user can kind of page through these results, open up this compare view, and see if the biographical information makes sense as well. And if they do find a match, both to the visuals and the biographical information, they can link them together using this identify button. Once that's done, the unknown photo is matched to the soldier profile, and now that soldier profile has two photos attached. So you can see we are using AI-based face recognition for this, coming from Microsoft's Azure Cognitive Services. You might be surprised to know that this works on historical photos, but it does. Although there are some unique challenges here. So we are talking about black and white photographs, so we don't have color. These images are typically lower resolution. They're printed on a paper. They're not digital. So we have less data to work with, and they might be damaged. They might have holes or discolorations or other artifacts of age that limit what we can do with them. So that's the AI component. What about the crowdsourcing component? So we really needed to also build a user community around this site. So we had, first of all, lots of social media groups that we could invite to check out this site. We also went to in-person events, different kinds of collectibles shows, antique shows, things like that. Brought the software, encouraged people to bring their photos by and try it out. We even tried to get onto different TV, radio, podcast type shows to get the word out that way. And talking to anybody in the media that would be willing to talk to us to let people know about what it is we were doing. So what did we find out? In the next part of the project, we studied the usage over the first month of its launch to try to see how successful people actually were with these identifications. So what we ended up finding was, in the first month, we had 88 unique soldier identifications. There are about 100 new identifications total, but a few of them were for the same soldiers. So that's 88 unique individuals. So in terms of the accuracy, we had an expert analyze each one of these 88 IDs and determine how many of them were correct. And there's different categories of IDs here. We broke them down by whether the view was the same or not. Is this the same exact photo of a soldier or a different photo of the same soldier? And then on the other hand, is there any inscription information? If there's no inscription information, that's the hardest case. But sometimes you might get some information, either a name or maybe a partial name, John or Brother Joe, or maybe just a rank, captain. So the easiest case has the same view and has some kind of inscription information. And we found that all 17 of those IDs were correct. The second two categories were medium difficulty, and those also performed well. We got 20 out of 20 positive matches there and 13 out of 13 positive matches there. So those were all correct. Also, the hardest category was when you had a different view of the soldier and no inscription information. In that case, we had a majority correct, but not all of them. 25 of the matches were correct and 12 were incorrect. So these were false identifications. And participants talked a little bit about what this process was like, the excitement of going through these photos and getting a hit. Finding that match was a lot of fun for them. And one user said, I found maybe 10 or 15% hits on the images that I had squirreled away. Some interesting success stories that I can share with you. This is one of my favorite examples. We had an unknown photograph in the Library of Congress collection. And through the Photo Sleuth software, we were able to match it to a paper photograph from the Maine State Archives collection. They even credited this Photo Sleuth website when the Library of Congress updated this information for this entry. Another example from a private collection, I think is just as fun. Here's a photograph that a collector found, and he picked it up simply because the photographer was from New Hampshire, and this collector focused on New Hampshire images, but he didn't have an ID for it. When he ran it through the Photo Sleuth software, the top result was for a soldier named William Baldwin, but he was actually from New York rather than New Hampshire. This was kind of puzzling. The collector wasn't really sure why this photo would have a back mark from New Hampshire if he was from New York. So he did some research. He found that William Baldwin was actually grew up in New Hampshire. So he thought, all right, there could be a connection here, but I can't guarantee it. I can't say that for sure. So a few weeks later, he's at a collectibles show, and sure enough, he comes across another copy of the photo that he had picked up. And this one has writing on the back of it. And the writing says, the name of the soldier is William H. Baldwin from the New York Engineers. So this Photo Sleuth result turned it out to be correct. And it was only through this facial recognition approach that he was able to discover this potential match. He mentioned that without that, he never would have even considered looking at New York soldiers for the identification. So as we launched the software, we saw some interesting immersion phenomenon from our user community. And one of those things was the crowdsourcing of second opinions. So as people started to get matches from the Photo Sleuth website, they started to ask on Facebook groups and other social media, hey, what do you all think? Is this actually a match? Is this correct? And people would weigh in. They would post in the comments, yeah, it looks good to me, or no, I don't think that uniform matches his service record, that sort of thing. We got more and more of these, and we realized, okay, the software is not doing everything that people needed to do here. People are looking for those second opinions. So we thought we needed to enhance the Photo Sleuth software with some way of supporting these requests for help. We drew on some theory from cognitive science to help motivate this new system. One of these ideas was the theory of similarity, and it says that if you're comparing different objects, things that are more similar are easier to find the differences than things that are totally different. So two apples here, it's easier to see the difference than an apple versus a pile of grapes. And the other concept is this high diagnostic feature concept, which basically says there's certain unique features to look for, and if that feature is present, then there's a very high likelihood that it's a match for the other object that has the same feature. So we ended up building a workflow where an expert would provide some high diagnostic features. So in this case, maybe as a high forehead or something like that. And then those would be used as visual clues for the crowd to kind of do this deep dive investigation. They would also classify, the expert would classify some of the high-level features of interest. And then the crowd comes in and does a more systematic investigation of the features that may or may not be similar. What you end up with is a result like this, where for the top 5 most similar matches returned by AI, one of them has more crowd agreement than the others. And this is the one that we want to be focusing on as a potential match. So we conducted an evaluation of this approach as well, that we call second opinion. And we compared it to what the AI baseline was performing. We found that AI itself actually doesn't do the best job here. You can see for these 5 test cases, the correct match in green is not correctly ranked first in 2 of the 5 cases. And even for the ones that are wrong, the difference of confidence is really small. It's only in the tenths or hundredths of a point. So you really need an extra layer of kind of human intelligence on top of this to make corrections for these very, very similar photos. So we compared how well individual worker ratings were versus aggregated worker ratings. And to cut to the chase, individual workers aren't that good at providing accurate ratings. But, and one of the reasons is that they are overly generous. They see more matches than there really are. So if you can account for that and you can weight it appropriately, you end up with a much more accurate crowdsourced rating system, where crowds are ranking the correct match number 1 in 7 out of the 10 cases. And that's pretty much a usable kind of result here. All right, so that takes me through those 2 projects. I want to offer some final thoughts here as we're running low on time. First is I think there is an interesting role for crowdsourcing and experts in contributing to this last mile problem. And you've probably heard about last mile in the context of communications or transportation, but I think it also applies here to these investigations of photos. And basically the pipeline of experts and crowds and AI that we imagine here for these search tasks starts with an expert and then takes us into an AI-based search that presents an initial set of results or ranked top matches. Then we have a crowd doing a more detailed investigation and presenting those results back to the crowd, to the expert, to make a final decision. Finally, I'd point out that I think this problem is going to be with us for a while, this last mile problem. As is discussed in this very interesting book, Ghost Work, by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri, there's this kind of paradox of automation's last mile where, you think you have a problem that AI can solve, but as soon as AI can solve that problem, the bar gets raised and you end up having some new edge cases that you need to deal with that ultimately you need to bring in that human expertise for. So I think our bar is going to continue to get raised. And even as AI progresses, we're always going to have a need for this sort of human intelligence to provide that final layer of decision-making and expertise at the last mile. So with that, I will wrap things up and thank you for your attention. Sorry for those technical issues, and I'll be happy to answer questions with any time that remains.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurt, for your time and insightful presentation. Now we're ready to entertain questions. Participants can put their questions on the chat window, and so we can ask Dr. Kurt those questions. While we wait for those questions, maybe let me start with the first question. How do you see the next challenges in this domain? You said the state level accuracy is about single-digit accuracy. So what can we do to improve that? It's maybe a shared responsibility that comes to individuals to actually I don't know. There are two data sets that you talked about. I wonder whether you have any ideas to see how we should go forward.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of promising paths forward. I think one of them is to do a better job of integrating the crowd feedback and expert feedback back into these pipelines. Right now, we're kind of imagining it as more of a one-way pipeline where we start with the best work that the AI can do, and then we're narrowing that down, and then crowd workers and experts are further narrowing it down, kind of like a needle in the haystack type thing. But I think, we can learn a lot from what these crowd workers are doing as they use these systems, and even what the experts are doing, and use that to feed back into the AI to improve its performance. And so hopefully it doesn't end up being this straightforward pipeline, but more of a cyclical process of learning. I think another promising path forward has to do with the growing capabilities of crowd workers. We're exploring more and more complex workflows for crowds. And so these very basic tasks, like comparing a satellite image or tile to a diagram, those can likely be more advanced in the future as we take advantage of the complex knowledge and capabilities of crowd workers. And so that might allow us to do a lot more than we can currently.
Cool. Do you have any other questions?
Dr. Luther, I have a question for you. So we have heard of deepfake technology generating these very convincing images and videos. So what is your thought on using AI to combat such, say, fake images or fake media? I know crowdsourcing is one way to make this happen, but I just want to get your thoughts on using AI to detect such things.
Yeah, a great question. I think there's two interesting ways of thinking about that. One is there have been some studies that look at how well humans themselves are able to analyze deepfake images and whether or not they're able to discern things that maybe AI can't. And it turns out the results there are still kind of mixed. Of course, AI is advancing rapidly, so even the findings of a year ago may no longer be accurate today. But we are already at the point now where people can be fooled, even through a detailed investigation of the images that they're looking at. So I think that that's kind of a wake-up call, that we're kind of already there. But another point to consider is that, and this comes more from folks on the journalism side, from an audience perspective, people don't even necessarily need deepfakes to be fooled by content that they encounter on the internet. And in fact, there's some interesting studies that show that shallow fakes, basically poorly conceived Photoshop jobs and things like that that don't really hold up to scrutiny, they're still pretty effective at fooling people and going viral and causing a shift in the understanding that the general public has. So the question becomes, where do we want to deploy these solutions for maximum benefit? If even a shallow fake can can fool a large cross section of the public. Where do we make the best investment of effort to prevent this from happening in the future?
Great question.
I have a question. Have you heard of Trace Labs? They're a group that does crowdsourcing to find missing people.
Yes, I'm familiar with Trace Labs, and I think it's a great organization. They've launched a number of these events and been a really nice model of how you can leverage crowdsourcing with expert oversight, because they do always partner with professional law enforcement or other professionals when they do their work. We took some inspiration from them and some other similar type OSINT CTF projects when we taught a class a couple years ago on open source intelligence, but we focused it on misinformation. So we took the idea of capturing the flag in open source intelligence, but instead of looking for missing people, which is what Trace Labs focuses on, we focused on capturing flags for misinformation. And it turns out we were able to get some of those same mechanisms working well for this other type of application.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Kurt. Any other questions? If not, let's thank the speaker for their time and consideration for this talk and the series. We'll be sending you as a token of appreciation a nice flag, so and certificate. Thank you so much. And this recording will be made available, so you will have access to it as well. I appreciate so much for your time today, Dr. Kurt. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to the audience for your attention, and sorry about those technical issues. I appreciate you bearing with me. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I hope to hear from you later.
Thank you.
Bye.